All right, well, welcome everyone out there in YouTube land to another episode of Household Journeys with me, Fabian. And in today's episode, what we're going to be making is a smokeless fire pit. Now, I got to say this, it's not exactly smokeless, but it does smoke less than a regular fire pit. So a little backstory here is I originally made a fire pit about a year or two ago, and I made it from one of those, galvanized trough. Now, the issue that I had with that was, well, it's galvanized steel. And after doing a little bit of research after the fact that I made it, was that you really don't want to be heating up galvanized steel, because galvanized steel is coated with zinc. It has a coating of zinc on the outside, and that's ultimately what keeps it from rusting. What I found out is that when you heat up zinc, it releases a lot of toxic fumes. So because of that, I decided to create a new fire pit from scratch, and to go with one that's made out of iron instead of galvanized steel. Now, the original fire pit that I created wasn't the best, and part of it was because I kind of threw it together, kind of half-assed it in a way. So now I know the science behind it a little bit better, and the way it works is that you want to have air gap in between the fire pit and the pavers. So what happens is that this air will flow into this gap, and then you have holes at the top of the fire ring that shoot inwards into the fire pit. And what that does is that pushes the smoke into the fire and essentially burns off the smoke, which creates that smokeless effect. So with that being said, let's go ahead and hit that title card, show you guys how to make this fire pit. So let's go. All right, so here's the original fire pit that I had, and as you can see, it was 4 layers high with pavers, which wasn't a good idea. It was just too tall. Now, I painted the inside of the galvanized trough here, the galvanized ring, with fireproof paint, but it didn't hold up very well, so not something I necessarily recommend. And you could also see that I put holes at the bottom. I also put holes at the top. Now, the holes, I did make adjustments to this in the new fire pit, and I'll show you guys what I mean by that earlier. Also, I believed I left too many air vents, too many gaps at the bottom of the, on the bottom layer of the pavers. So I also minimized that as well. And then here at the top, you can see that I tried to seal the top of the ring with pavers, which was not a good idea. It left a lot of air gaps. So a lot of the air would escape from those gaps instead of pushing the air and pushing that smoke back into the fire pit. So the fire pit that I purchased it off of Amazon. I'll put a link to that in the description. The description did say that this was iron, so it should work out very nicely. Shouldn't really have any issues with rust. And it comes in 4 panels. Also, it includes all the hardware that you need, and here's a shot of the screws with the nuts that it comes with, and you tighten these down using an Allen wrench. I also used some high heat mortar to seal all the pavers and to seal the fire ring to the pavers. And as you can see here, it's meant for high heat. It can go up to 2000 degrees. So what I ended up doing is that I put a bead of that right there where the panels meet to seal up that joint. And because there's 4 panels, I ended up doing this 4 times. For the most part, the panels went together pretty well. But when I got to the very end, when I had that last joint that I had to put together, I did have to hammer that in a little bit because the holes didn't line up quite too well. So I used a rubber mallet to prevent damaging or dinging, warping the metal in any kind of way. And it worked out just fine. So afterwards, what I ended up doing was I had to drill the holes at the top. And to do that, I used a 1/2 inch step up bit, which worked out pretty well. Now, if you're going to do this, I do recommend that you buy some kind of metal cutting lubricant or some kind of lubricant for cutting metal, because it keeps your bit cool, and by keeping your bit cool, it stays sharper longer, so you can drill holes more efficiently, because no one wants to be drilling holes with a dull bit. And the way I figured this out was that I seen some people, what they would do is that they would take some tape, wrap it around the ring in order to kind of get a measurement, and then they would take that piece of tape, lay it down flat so that they can evenly space out all of the holes. I didn't do that. I just eyeballed it, and in my suggestion, I would say make about 8 to 10 holes per panel. There's 4 panels, so you should have anywhere between 32 to 40 holes. And the reason I say that I just eyeballed it, because also, in my opinion, the spacing, as long as you have a relatively consistent spacing, you should be fine. I don't really think it's that serious to where you need to be anything super precise. Okay, so once I had all the holes drilled out, and just give you guys an approximation, that probably took me like about an hour to drill all those holes. But once I had those holes, I went ahead and started stacking up my pavers. Now here, what I ended up doing was that on the bottom layer, I left 4 gaps. Each gap was about 2 inches. And then after that, I went ahead and started putting the other 2 layers of pavers. Now, I did have to purchase a brick that was the same style as the pavers. The only issue is that it wasn't as thick as the pavers itself, so it does leave like a little bit of a gap there. But I'll show you guys how I fill that out a little bit later. And the other thing that I did was that when I did this, when I was setting up the pavers to get the sizing right, what I wanted is I wanted a gap between the fire ring and the pavers to be the thickness of my hand. And I found that that was sufficient enough to get a good amount of airflow from the outside of the fire pit up and to shoot out through the holes of the fire ring. So another issue that I ended up facing was that the fire ring only went down about 10 inches. So I had a pretty big gap from the fire ring to the ground. Luckily though, I had this piece of aluminum, this roll of aluminum that was about 6 inches. So I went ahead and I rolled that inside of the fire pit. So once I figured out about how much aluminum I needed, I just went ahead and cut that out with my tin snips. What I ended up doing next is that I took some of that high heat mortar and I started sealing up and filling in all the crevices, all the gaps in between the pavers, because you really want to seal this up so that way you don't have any air escape once you start your fire. You really want to have all that airflow be contained so that way you get to maximize the airflow that shoots out of those holes and into your fire. Once I sealed up all the cracks on the inside, I went around with a flashlight and I held the flashlight on the outside so that way if I saw any light coming in between any of the pavers, I knew that there was a gap there. So I just went ahead and filled in the spots that I missed. Once I had all of that done, I put a really giant, really thick bead of the mortar at the top of the pavers. And I have a little dip right there towards the top where there was a brick. It wasn't a paver, it was a brick. So I just gobbed up a bunch of that mortar on there, kind of get that ring of mortar flush. So that's how I ended up filling in, or I should say that's how I ended up compensating for that little dip that I had there. Okay, and then I went ahead and inserted the fire ring back into the fire pit, pressed it down. Now, because the pavers aren't perfectly level with each other, and even though I did put a giant bead of the mortar, I didn't get full contact between the mortar and the fire ring, so I had to go around and apply a second bead to fill in more of those uneven gaps. So the instructions say to let it dry out for about 24 hours. If you want to be a little bit on the safer side, go 48. I went 48 and I didn't have any issues. All right, so once I had everything in place, I went ahead and filled in the bottom with some sand. I put a couple of pavers down in there to create some air gaps, and those air gaps help provide airflow into the bottom of the fire to get the fire a little bit hotter and a little bit bigger. Now, when I ended up putting the sand in there, a thing I want to add is that the sand served a couple of purposes. First off, I applied the sand in there and I tried to shape it in kind of like a bowl manner, so that way the air can help circulate and flow in a little bit easier. And then the other thing too was that the sand acts as a heat barrier for the concrete and also for the aluminum. Aluminum begins to melt at about 1200 degrees, I believe. And by having that sand there, it helps protect the aluminum from that heat. At this point, I have a fire going on, and you can see that there's still a little bit of smoke, and that's going to happen. You are going to get a couple of clouds here and there, especially in the beginning. What I found that with this fire pit, it took about 30 minutes, sometimes even up to 45 minutes, until it really started smoking clearly. But you can see that I took a pellet tube, filled it up with just a handful of pellets, and you can see how much more smoke is coming off of just those smoldering pellets compared to the fire pit itself. Also, when the fire wasn't too hot yet, you can see that the smoke isn't really getting pulled in. There's not a lot of airflow going into those gaps between the pavers. But interesting thing though is that you can actually see the smoke getting sucked into the fire at the top of the fire pit. That was something that I was not expecting to see. And then once the fire really got going and the iron was nice and hot, you can actually begin to faintly see some of the smoke starting to shoot out through the holes that I drilled at the top of the fire ring. And so the reason you want this to happen is because the way the smokeless effect works is that it creates a secondary combustion. So the first combustion is the fire that comes from the wood itself. But the second combustion occurs from the airflow. That's why the airflow is so important, and it's so important that you seal everything best you can, because fresh air will get sucked in through those gaps in the pavers on that first layer. And then as the airflow travels its way up, it gets heated by the iron. So that way when the air reaches those holes, it comes out a little bit pressurized, and what it ends up doing is that it ends up pushing the smoke back into the fire. And that's where the second combustion occurs. By pushing that smoke back into the fire burns the smoke. So those smoke particles never really get a chance to go up into the air. And then here I put the smoke tube at the top. So this is another thing to be aware of, is that if you stack your wood too high and you have something that's burning above the holes of the ring, you're going to get a lot of smoke. In order to have that smokeless effect, the combustion needs to occur below the holes. Because if the smoke is above the holes, then the holes don't have the opportunity to use the airflow to push the smoke back into the fire. So another thing that I ended up doing is that I ended up putting the smoke tube inside of the fire pit just to see how the air circulates in there. And you can see that the smoke keeps getting pushed back into the fire, which I found to be a pretty cool effect, because just off of the design of this fire pit, you can really see how the smoke just kind of circulates, it bounces off the walls and just rolls back into the fire, which helps create less smoke. So then I came up with this idea, what if I introduced more airflow? So what I did was that I took my leaf blower, and I started blowing air into one of the gaps in between the pavers. And I don't really think it did too much. It just made the smoke and the fire go a little bit crazier, but I don't think it made it more efficient. I don't really think the extra airflow really helped with anything. So at this point, you can see that I have a pretty good fire going on and virtually no smoke. It is extremely clear. It's burning very nicely. Granted, there's still a couple of little puffs of smoke here and there, but also the more seasoned the wood is, the cleaner your wood will burn as well. The wood I have here has been dry for only about a year, and the fact that it is this clear goes to show how well this fire pit works. Now, I know in a lot of other designs, smokeless fire pits that other people have made, they have put holes at the bottom of the fire ring. I didn't do that. I did not put any holes at the bottom. The only holes that I created in the fire pit were just that top portion. And people have said that those bottom holes help introduce more airflow, more oxygen into the fire, which creates a better fire. And in my opinion, I don't really think that's too necessary. I found that this fire pit burns great. I think it sucks in a lot of air as is, and it gets all the oxygen that it needs. So in my opinion, I would skip that step. I did, and you can see how well it works without those extra holes at the bottom. So again, very nice clean burn. It burns almost as clean as something you would see with a gas fire. Now, the other thing that I ended up doing was that I originally used Pavers inside of the fire pit to kind of create a little bit of airflow underneath the fire. And that's where I would also put the wood. I would put the wood on top of those Pavers. Well, after looking at a couple of more things, you really don't want to use stuff that absorbs water in the fire itself. The Pavers that I was using, they can absorb water, and that's a bad thing because if you have pavers or rocks that can retain moisture, well, when you heat them up and you heat them up super fast, super hot, the pressure from that moisture wanting to evaporate can cause those pavers and those rocks to explode. So finding that out, I got kind of paranoid. So what I ended up doing was I ended up buying a fire grate off of Amazon. And this fire grate was about $115, something like that. And what I liked about it was that it had a 24-inch diameter. So it fit inside well of my fire pit because my fire pit has a 36-inch diameter. And it also had these little legs at the bottom. So that leaves an air gap at the bottom, so that way air and oxygen can flow and feed into the fire from underneath. And assembly was pretty easy. It came with all the hardware. Only thing the only extra thing that I did is that I just used my drill to kind of tighten up all the pieces. But here you can see that how it looks inside the fire pit, and you can see how I'm able to stack all the wood on top of the grate. Now here you can see a considerable amount of smoke coming from this fire. This is at the beginning of when all this wood was burning, but once it got hot, and I had to kind of reposition a couple of logs, then it became really clean, and you can see right here that there's almost no smoke in this fire pit. All right, so there's our smokeless fire pit. I'm going to say that this was a very successful project. I found that it works absolutely amazing. Took me just a few hours, so if you're interested in doing this, you could probably do it in one afternoon. And one of the benefits that I found to be absolutely great about this smokeless fire pit is that now I can actually go outside and enjoy a fire without smelling like smoke afterwards. So Hopefully you guys enjoyed this episode of Household Journeys. I am Fabian. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys later.